Hello again. This is the second module on copyright issues relating to open source licensing. I'm Malcolm Bain, and we will, in this module, look specifically at open source licenses. The objective of this module is to understand the scope and the main classification of these open source licenses, because there are many and they are not all the same, and to contrast this with proprietary licensing models. This is the second of the 4 videos, and once we have seen this free and open source licensing issues, we will look at how to manage them and what challenges there are. This unit is divided in 2. First of all, we look at the background and the development of FOSS licensing, and then in detail we will look at the different open source licenses. Where does FOSS come from? Well, basically the principles of open source and open source licensing are based on the development model, which is in fact the driver for the open source movement. The development of open source is different from proprietary in various manners. Principally, its technical characteristics, which makes it more modular. There's a high reuse of third-party components as developers search around the web and looked for existing software modules that already fulfill the functionality that they want. And because of this, it is fairly compliant with standards to ensure interoperability. In terms of organization, FOSS is also developed in a very different way from proprietary software. Whereas proprietary software is usually developed in a single company or entity, open source development is distributed among various communities who share a specific desire to work on this software. There is no central representation or negotiation, although these days some open source projects are centralized, such as in the Apache Foundation, the Mozilla Foundation, and other very large open source projects. And there are a variety of community or organizational models for coordinating the development of this open source projects. Some of them have no model at all. They're just 3-10 people working together, and there's no specific organization. On the other hand, you may find very large formalized communities, such as the Apache or Eclipse communities, which are open, participatory, but do have formal processes for organizing the community. And then we also have closed or more controlled communities, such as Android, where Google leads the development and more or less controls the releases of the new versions. So to ensure to articulate on a legal basis this totally heterogeneous and horizontal, like the bazaar, it's been called a bazaar, i.e. there's no hierarchical structure. The open source licenses have been found to be a significant and important means for ensuring harmony within the specific projects. An open source license, as we will see, as opposed to a proprietary license, provides nearly all the copyright rights. If you remember, we saw that copyright includes reproduction, transformation, distribution, and communication. And what an open source license does to enable this collaborative development is to permit third parties copying, modifying, and distributing the software. Also, to ensure this distributed development model, everybody has access to the source code. You may find this obvious today because we have centralized repositories like SourceForge or GitHub, but in the old days, before these centralized repositories, source code used to be was managed in source code versions, but not in a centralized SaaS model like today. So to support, from a legal point of view, this distributed development, the open source licenses were invented, so to speak, to ensure that this could happen. Okay, so the implications of this is obviously that developers can share and reuse software components. There's high element of transparency and visibility on corrections, as you know that all the bugzillas and bugs can be seen in the different projects, and different people can work on those bugs. and development is very collaborative and heterogeneous. Also, it means, as a side benefit in a manner, that users can also benefit from all of this. They are free to download, install, test, and use. So the user is also a developer, because many of the developers are in fact end users in terms of, for example, infrastructure software or technology that are built for the large technical architectures. Not all, and in fact, I would imagine the minority of open source software is end user desktop software, such as OpenOffice or Videolan. So the users also benefit from this development model by being able to download, install, test, and redistribute the software. What is this based on? Well, the first basis, above and beyond the fact that academics and researchers enjoy sharing software and sharing their knowledge, this was first crystallized by Richard Stallman in 1989 in the Free Software Manifest, which you've seen before, which defines the 4 freedoms with respect to software. The first is the freedom to run the program for any purpose. So a license cannot impose any restriction on the type of use, and it must enable all forms of running the program. The second freedom is the freedom to study and to adapt the software. So access to the source code, but also to understand the algorithms, to improve those algorithms. And the third one is to redistribute copies of the software, so that if you received a really good software that works very well, you can also pass this on and ensure that other people can use the software. The fourth freedom is based on the second, which is to improve the program and to distribute those improvements so that everybody can share your improvements. And these are called the 4 freedoms of free software. Freedom, of course, refers to freedom and not in free of charge, as in free beer, as often is said. Okay. The second or parallel way of looking at free and open source software is the open source movement. There's no real significant difference between free software and open source software, despite a lot of community muddle and FUD about this. In legal terms, there is no difference between a free software license and an open source license. The difference is mainly in terms of ethics and philosophy and approach. And in 1998, the open source movement initiative was set up based on the open source definition, which comes from the Debian guidelines. And what they wanted to do was to organize a little bit the community, because there are many, many licenses, and they wanted to make this more transparent and more easy for people to understand, and to focus on the practical aspects of open source in terms of access to the source code and improving the quality of the code. And this gave rise to the definition, the open source definition, which is used as criteria for understanding if a license is open source or not. And you will see here the same freedoms or the same rights as for free software. Freedom to use it, freedom to redistribute, access to the source code, a freedom to make changes, and no discrimination or no restrictions on the type of use you can make for this software. Okay, so those are the historical and conceptual approaches to open source licensing. Now, in the second part, let's look at how this is implemented in terms of licenses. So what is an open source license? Well, it's a license which complies with the requirements of freedom, as set out by Richard Stallman, or the open source definition as set out by the Open Source Initiative. And in contrast, obviously, is a proprietary or closed source licensing, which does not grant these freedoms and does not grant access to the source code in many cases. This should not be confused or opposed to commercial software. A lot of open source software, or FOSS, can be commercial. I mean, for example, Red Hat Enterprise is based on Fedora open source and is licensed, is provided under commercial contracts with support, with maintenance, with educational materials, etc., etc. So the commercialization of software is totally independent of whether it is proprietary or open source. In terms of legal characteristics, A FOSS license is often seen as a contract. In most jurisdictions, this will be seen as a contract, i.e. an agreement between two parties which sets out specific rights and specific obligations. And these terms are accepted, or supposedly accepted implicitly, when you download the code and you start using it, and even more if you distribute it. So, like any contract, it sets out certain rights, obviously the copyright rights, the rights to make copies, to transform, to distribute, to share the software. In open source licenses, there are no royalties, there are no licensing fees, but there are certain obligations, and we will see next exactly what those obligations are and how those are articulated. So if you look at an anatomy of an open source license, just as we looked at the anatomy of a proprietary license, it's pretty similar. There are common elements, which in this case are the grant of rights, i.e. those rights which are provided or are given to the user, in this case much more than a proprietary license, which was just installation and use. Here you will have the use to make further copies, to transform and to distribute both the software and the improvements that you've made. There are also in nearly every single open source license requirements to attribute and to keep the copyright notices, and all of them disclaim warranties and liabilities, so that the initial or the open source developer could not be sued for and incur any liabilities. What differentiates the open source software is the extent to which the license imposes obligations on further distribution, and we're about to explain this. Okay. Also, licenses are distinguished or have differences whether they include a patent grant, whether they include a procedure in relation to termination, or if there are obligations with respect to trademarks or other issues like this. Okay. So, on the one hand, if you can imagine the freest or the most permissive licenses, we have the what are called the permissive or academic licenses. These are licenses that impose the minimum restrictions on the user. An example is the BSD or the MIT or the Apache licenses. Okay, so they allow unlimited redistribution, copying, reproduction, modification, and use. And they have very, very, very few obligations. In fact, this case, the only real substantive obligation is to keep a copy of the copyright notice and the disclaimer and the license with the code. So if you redistribute it, you must ensure that that goes with the code. It doesn't matter if it's open source or closed source. You still have to make sure those copyright notices go with the code. And here we have an example, the BSD license, which basically says that redistribution and use, so you can redistribute and you can use it with or without modification, so it grants the right to transform, are permitted, providing, as I said before, you maintain copies of these notices. And here, in capital letters, is the typical limitation of warranties and liabilities. Another example is the MIT license, which is a bit more complete and sets out specifically all the things you can do: use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, even sell copies of the software, and to permit other people to do so with the single condition of maintaining the copyright notice and the disclaimers. Okay, and if you look here, there's a useful website called TLDR, which has summaries of the licenses setting out what you can do, so commercial use, modification, distribution, sublicensing, private use, and what you cannot do, so disclaiming. Okay, and what are the obligations? Well, include copies of the notices and the license. We'll see this is very different from the next series of licenses, which fall under what we call copyleft. Copyleft is a mechanism which was invented by Richard Stallman and Eben Moglen, his lawyer, to ensure that once a code has been freed under an open source or free license, it remains free because it imposes a single condition or a single additional condition, that when you redistribute the code or you redistribute improvements of that code, then that must go under the same license, i.e. it must stay free. Okay? Obviously, it means that if you are maintaining the same license, you must also provide a copy of the source code. Okay, and this is very, very famous in the GPL2, General Public License versions 2, which says that you must cause that any work that you distribute, so any improvements or the same work, that includes the program, the copylefted program, the GPL program, it must be licensed as a whole at no charge, so no cost, to under the same terms of this license. So you must keep the same license. But it's only when you distribute or publish it. There's no obligation to publish the code or to use the license, even if you just do internal use and modifications. Okay, so this means that once a code has been made available under the GPL, then it is always under the GPL, and improvements are also under the GPL. And this has been very, very popular. About 60% of the open source license code is under the GPL. This is reducing now. There's been more and more people using permissive licenses, but it is still a very, very strong concept. The concept has been used in other licenses. The lesser GPL, which I'll explain afterwards, the Affero GPL, which means that not only when you distribute the software, but also when you make it available as a SaaS, as a copyleft in the cloud, then also the user has a right to request a copy of the source code under that license. So it's copyleft in the cloud and not just on distribution. The Mozilla Foundation, with Netscape, when it was first released, created a copyleft, form of copyleft, as did Sun when it created CDDL. The European Union itself, the European Commission license for European public code is a copyleft license. And for example, the Eclipse public license is also a copyleft license. So all these licenses require that if you redistribute this code, it must be under that same license and you cannot close it. Okay, so you must not only maintain copyright notices, provide a copy of the license, but you must use the same license and provide access to the source code. Okay, but there are differences. Here, for example, we've got an example of GPL3. You see it's much longer, much more complex license than the BSD. Okay, and here back to TLDR, we see that the rights are the same, use, modification, etc., etc., but the must are much longer. Include the same code, state the changes, disclose the source, etc. This is a summary, quick summary for you. Okay, but there are different types of copyleft. Basically, because some people have wanted a more reduced scope. They don't want copyleft to touch, to extend to so much code. So there's a concept of weak copyleft or lesser copyleft, which means that just that code remains copyleft. If it's embedded as a library in a larger work, or it's used as a library, then it does not mean that the whole work has to be under the GPL or under copyleft. It just means that this library remains free. Whereas strong copyleft, which is represented by the GPL, the AGPL, means that not just that library, but the works that use that library, works that are based on that library, must also be under the GPL. So if you create a new work, a new functionality that takes advantage of a GPL library, well then your new work has to be under the GPL if you want to use that library. Okay? If it was under the library GPL, that would not be the case. You would distribute your code as you want under the license of your choice, but the library that goes with it, the GPL, LGPL library that goes with it, must go under the LGPL. Okay? This creates a whole ecosystem or a whole variety of different types of licenses, and there are about 6 which are the most common. There's the BSD, there's the LGPL, GPL, LGPL family, there's the Mozilla family. Eclipse, because of its popularity and with the Common Public License and the Eclipse Public License, has become very popular, and the huge project, Apache Foundation projects, also are very popular. So we can have a kind of like a table setting out the different options. We have permissive licensing, which have no restrictions on reuse. Well, the example is the BSD or MIT Apache license, and these are used in Android, Apache Web Server, obviously, OpenStack, PHP. We have, on the other hand, strong copyleft, where all redistributions of the work and improvements must be under the same license. This has had a lot of uptake. Obviously, the GNU Linux is the most famous, but Ascaris, the GIMP, MySQL, Drupal, all of these are under the GPL family of licenses. And in the middle we have the weak copyleft, which means that only the core code stays copyleft. LGPL, Mozilla license, Common Public License, has also been very popular in the professional open source area as well. And examples here are given, which you can look at your own time. Okay, where can we find these licenses? Well, the easiest place to find them is at opensource.org, which has a list of those licenses organized alphabetically, or actually, as you can see here, by category. So what can we say about this? There is a large spread of free and open source licenses. From a legal perspective, we do not distinguish between free and open source. This is why we use the term FOSS. But inside that ecosystem, you do have to be very aware of the differences between permissive licensing, which are usually of academic origin, and these do not impose any restrictions on reuse, and copyleft licenses, where depending on the type of copyleft, you need to maintain the same open or free license for the code and for improvements of that code and works or programs that use that code. What we will see is the impact of this in the next teaching unit, because when you are using these free and open licenses in a software project, you have to understand the licenses, but we also have to understand how to use these licenses and what the impact is. And that's what we're going to see next. And so, summarizing both the first and the second unit, what we see is that in the software environment, there is a whole ecology between proprietary software, which is closed source, non-proprietary or open source software, which includes public domain. There is some software which is in the public domain, specifically released by the US government. And there's the concept of commercial software, which could be either proprietary or open source, but includes commercial terms as to payments of fees and commercial support, etc., etc. And in fact, we see an even more when you're looking at licensing and licensing of the code. For example, and this is a table from a public university, and what they were doing when they were releasing software. They looked at different source code licenses when the university made the source code available, and here between free licensing and royalty commercial licensing. Sometimes they would just release an SDK, a binary, again either for free, for gratuito, free, or for commercial, or they would actually, we will see later, dual license, so they could give it under an open source but also a commercial license, or forget any licensing at all and just provide the software as a service, so have it hosted on a server. And this picture gives us an idea of all the types of licensing, a summary of the licensing of software, and we see in red here where open source licensing fits in. It's for free with availability of the source code. Open source licensing is not just limited to software, although this is not the focus of this course. Open source or free sharing licenses have been developed by the Creative Commons movement and on documentation. The Wikipedia used to be under the GNU free document license and now is under Creative Commons by share alike. And also the same concepts are being applied in the area of data. So you have open database licenses where people are making data available under similar concepts of freedom and access. So, what have we seen in this little module? First of all, we've seen what the definition is and the requirements are for an open source license, which means free and open source. We've looked at the different types of license that are there and how they've been classified between permissive and copyleft. And we've looked at in detail a little bit more the different types of copyleft between weak copyleft on libraries, for example, strong copyleft, which includes works and derivative works, and even cloud copyleft for when you use the copyleft in the cloud. What we will see in the next module is how this impacts the management of an open source project and how to deal with these licenses in that context. Thank you very much.